Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Hello dear listener, how are you? Autumn can be a funny time, and I've personally found this one quite tough for some reason. The earth has seemed rather heavy of late, and it seems many of you are feeling it too. Everyone seems to be a bit run down and tired. Perhaps fitting for a time when we are preparing to shift into hibernation mode. So, what are you taking into the depths of winter with you? New skills, new friends, a fresh sense of who you are, hope for a better future? Or maybe this is just a time to take a well-deserved rest. Whatever you do, I wish you well over the coming weeks, as this is the last of Series 2, and I'll be launching Series 3 on January the 2nd. But never fear, I'll be releasing 2 bonus episodes between now and then. And if you want to stock up more on some unheard content, you can join the Curious crew at Patreon and simultaneously support the project. That is patreon.com/the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. Big love to my dear patrons. You, Curious crew, are wonderful, and I appreciate your companionship in all of this. Our Discord chat is this Tuesday, and I shall of course be updating you over the season. We have our first patron-only event coming up in early January, which is a tea ceremony workshop run by one of our previous guests, a great way to start the year. And I'm delighted to be ending the second series with an interview with anthropologist of the paranormal, Dr. Jack Hunter. Excitingly, this episode was also videoed, so if you'd like to see the interview, the YouTube link is on the show notes, scarletofthefay.com. I really enjoyed this chat, and I hope you do too. We talk about his own experience and his sister's fairy encounter, the folklore of the Tanat Valley, boggle thresholds, the occult revival, and many of the theories that he's using to make sense of these experiences from an anthropological point of view. Jack's work is genuinely exciting, and if you haven't already read any of his books, then I highly recommend in particular Greening the Paranormal and Spirits, Gods and Magic, for which he wrote a short course, which hopefully will be available again next year. There'll be more information about his research and links to some of his excellent online lectures on the show notes at scarletofthefay.com, where you can also drop me a line from there and let me know how you're getting on, what you think of all of this, and any experiences that you may have had yourself. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at _remain_curious. For now, much love, stay well, do what you want to do, don't do what you don't want to do. There's a challenge for the winter holidays, and, of course, remain curious. Time to renovate, transmute, time to renovate. So I'm really excited to have with us for this, the last episode of Series 2. Dr. Jack Hunter has come on to have a conversation with me about all things weird from the perspective of anthropology. So we're going to have a chat around some of the bits that we've covered in this series, just to get Jack's viewpoint. So Jack is an anthropologist researching consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. He teaches at the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology in Culture. That's part of the University of Wales Trinity Saint David. He also co-edits Time and Mind, the Journal of Archaeology, Consciousness and Culture. And so you're a bass guitarist as well, aren't you?
I am, yeah.
With a very cool looking, I did check it out. Is it kind of experimental psych jazz, psych rock?
Yeah.
Jazz rock?
That's about it. Space rock, psychedelic prog.
Yeah, it's excellent. I enjoyed that.
Great, thank you.
And I think my husband was particularly impressed that you are an ordained Buddhist priest.
I am indeed. I can do weddings in some states in America.
Oh, is it just in America then?
In some states, I don't know, not all states. I don't know about the UK.
Oh, surely the UK. You'll have to sort that out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for, making the time to come and speak to me, because I think I got in touch with you around the beginning of series 1 just to say you might be interested in this, and I was flabbergasted that you'd already listened to 1 or 2 of them. So that was really great. So I mean, you've written 10 books on this kind of subject. I know that you've got one coming out,
A Deep Weird, yeah.
and that's the one that I was looking at most recently, actually, the talk that you did about that. So I'll put a link on the site for that. But obviously we know well the Greening the Paranormal, which I have spoken about a lot, your Spirits, Gods and Magic book, which you designed a short course for, and also the Manifesting Spirits. You've got such a sort of broad view anthropologically of looking at all of this. So I just wondered if you could kind of talk us through the theories that might apply to some of the experiences that we've heard about in the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast.
Well, yeah, I mean, very broadly, my research has been interested in different ways that we sort of, or that people experience, we might call it the spiritual or the supernatural and all those kind of things. And my doctoral research was not to do with fairies, but to do with spirit mediums in Bristol, and the ways that mediums use their bodies in order to manifest spirits, which is the title of the book, essentially. Yeah, and what I realized with at the Bristol Spirit Lodge, and with these people who are basically devoting their daily lives to developing mediumship, was that, and I looked at it in a sort of cross-cultural context as well, was that the things that they were doing, of paying careful, close attention to the body of the medium, picking up on small little movements and things like that, which were taken as indications that spirits were trying to manifest, and then sort of honing in on that and establishing a dialogue and building up this gradual relationship with a particular spirit. And it might take, it could take weeks or months for a spirit to fully manifest. But I realized that it was this gradual process of in-depth kind of observations that kind of linked these practices in with other, animistic kinds of practices or shamanistic practices, where, people would, for example, spend a lot of time in a particular place and focus in on the details of that place and engage in a dialogue with the place. So really the processes of manifesting spirits that I observed in the lodge are really similar to the processes involved in manifesting spirits in a natural setting or, in a particular place.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that although my research was not specifically to do with, fairies, actually these processes are running throughout all of this, similar processes, the way that invisible agents are manifested and the way that we interact and engage with them.
Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com. absolutely. That seminar that you did recently about the Tanat Valley is really excellent. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I mean, I think that that is really relevant also to what we're looking at here.
Yeah, well, I'll introduce the Tanat Valley first. The Tanat Valley is a valley in mid Wales, in Powys. It's where I live, and it's where I've actually grown up as well. So I've lived here pretty much all my life, except for a brief stint in Bristol. And it's sort of people think of it kind of like as a gateway into Wales. It leads from Shropshire, more or less, into the Berwyn Mountains. And then if you go up into the Berwyns, over the Berwyns, you end up in Snowdonia, and then you're deep in Wales then. So it's kind of like a gateway into Wales. And it's kind of rolling hills, valleys, lots of little valleys shooting off this main valley, the Tanat Valley, which follows the River Tanat down pretty much from west to east towards Shropshire. And yeah, it's a lovely place. It's very beautiful. And there was a few stories sort of folklore stories that I had been aware of in the area. Stories to do with, there's one story about a dragon or something called a gwyber or a viper in Llanrhydr, one of the villages where I've lived, which is a well-known story. And the primary school there even has a mural of this dragon on the wall there. So, people know about that story. There are standing stones in the village that are associated with the dragon. The story is that the dragon was killed on one of the standing stones after a wise woman told him to erect a stone, put spikes on it and cover it with a red sheet, and the dragon will kind of like bash into it on its way over. So those standing stones are still there, and people know about those stories. But there are other stories that people don't really seem to know that much about. Specifically things to do with fairies. Okay, so it seems like this fairy folklore in the area has kind of disappeared. And I only became aware of the folklore relatively recently. I think it was last year or just the year before, when my friend gave me a copy of a book called A Wanderer in North Wales by Cledwyn Hughes. And he was a Labour MP for Anglesey, a big island in the north of Wales. And he wrote in the 1940s, it was published in the early 50s, about his wanders through North Wales, basically. And what was interesting about this, and so my friend gave me a copy of the book, is that he explicitly mentions this area here that I live in. And he talks about the Tanat Valley as well. And he mentioned a few things in there that I found really interesting and that I'd never heard of before, specifically referencing some places as the abode of the fairies, places that I'd known of and spent a lot of time in my childhood. And there are legends associated with that place, but they weren't fairy stories that I was aware of. So this was really interesting for me. And he also mentioned the hounds of hell, and how people had seen the hounds of hell on the slopes of the Berwyn Mountains right around where I grew up in Llangynnog. And that sounded really interesting. I'd never heard that. I did know that there had been a supposed UFO crash in the 1970s, the Berwyn incident. And that's a crazy experience in itself.
Yeah.
Which I talk about in that talk. So, there were things that I was aware of in the valley, stories that, and things like that, but I wasn't aware of any specific fairy folklore. And that's doubly strange because I'd had my own fairy experience in the valley. I kind of thought of it as an isolated event when it happened. I didn't think of it necessarily as maybe being part of a bigger, patchwork of folklore or anything like that.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't aware of this fairy folklore. And my sister also had an experience when we were both younger, that she told me about back in the day. And I recently asked her to describe the experience or write it up for me again. And yeah, she described how she'd seen in my mum and dad's house, and it must have been about 1998 or thereabouts, this small, she described him as a little leprechaun, a small man, about 6 inches tall, with red hair and sort of shabby green clothes on. And he did a little dance for her. It's like a classic fairy experience.
Totally. It's yeah.
Amazing.
Great one.
And and my experience was slightly less classic, but it was a psychedelic experience. It was in the context of my first mushroom trip. And I saw these small seem to be two-dimensional creatures in the grain of wood of a chest of drawers. The drawer was kind of hanging out of the chest at the top, and they were in the grain of the wood. And it was like a little procession, and they seemed to be moving along deliberately, and all the other kind of psychedelic stuff was going on around it. But these little goblin-looking creatures were doing their own thing. And they clocked me, they looked at me, but they were not fussed that I'd seen them, and they just kind of carried on with their procession. And I must have sort of lost interest in it and started to pay attention to something else. But again, it's that attention thing that I was talking about with, when you're in these psychedelic states, you can get very intimately focused onto something very specific, and perhaps that was a contributor to this experience that I've had. Similarly, my sister's experience was while she was falling asleep,
right?
Hypnopompic or hypnagogic kind of state. So but those experiences occurred before I was aware of any of this extra folklore that I've become aware of. So when I started to look into that, I started to find lots of interesting things. And I found one particular experience that happened at the beginning of the 1800s. It was written about by a guy called Elias Owen, who collected a lot of folklore in Wales, and he lived in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr, just down the road from here. There's a plaque in the church there, if you go in, that says, "To the memory of Elias Owen, author of Welsh folklore."
Oh, great.
Pretty nice. Yeah, very good. And he wrote a little story about this guy who lived in a village. It's not even a village, it's a little hamlet called Bwlchydda, which is between Llangedwin, where I live, and Llanfyllin, where I went to high school. And in the story, this man wakes up in his bedroom, and he's only got a very simple little bedroom, and he sees a little man sitting on the end of his bed with a fiddle, and he's playing the fiddle furiously, like fairies do. And there's up to some smaller fairies dancing in a circle on the floor in his room. And he asks them, "Who are you?" And they say, "Ysbrydion yr awyr," which it means spirits of the air in Welsh. A very strange thing for them to say, but it has these kind of animistic, almost undertones in it. Like these are spirits of the air. But it's very strange, this experience in the same valley, essentially the same as my sister's experience, separated by 200 years or something like that.
Yeah.
Very odd. So you've got an issue, thinking about the relationship between experiences and folklore, which is something interesting to ponder.
And landscape.
And landscape, of course, yeah. And there were other stories that I found specifically about Craig Cruach, one of the mountains in Llangynog, which it's where I grew up. And when I was young, and my sisters were younger, my cousins would come from Liverpool, and we'd all go and climb around on the mountain, and spent a lot of time on there. Me and my friends in the band had gone up into the caves, and we jammed in the caves and all sorts of things. So been all over this mountain and scrabbled it, and knew it inside out pretty much. And another interesting thing about it is when my cousins used to come, we would create and draw maps of the mountain and create sort of like a mythical kingdom on there. And all of the parts of the mountain we'd kind of given names. And we said dwarves would live in that. It was kind of like, Lord of the Rings kind of rip-off stuff. But, we were kids. But, we were saying like this is the area where the elves live, and this is the area where the dwarves live, and there are goblins down in the mines and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And all of it completely unaware of the actual folklore that's associated with it.
Just kind of instinctive, more of an instinctive play.
Is it like, is there something about it that kind of feeds out? So that some of the actual folklore that I found is amazing. There's a local archaeologist called Robert Richards in the 1930s, and he published his writings in the Montgomeryshire collections, which is published by the Powisland Club, who are like the learned society of Powys, based in Welshpool. And he wrote up some of the folklore of the Tanat Valley, having grown up here, and he explicitly mentions Craig Ruath, and he talks about how it was well known as a haunt of the fairies, and the hut circles that are on top of it, because on the top of the hill, it's been used for a very long time. On the very top, there's an Iron Age hill fort, and you can go up there and you can see all of the hut circles. And in the 19th century, Llanganog was actually one of the most heavily industrialized parts of the country, mining slate and lead. So it was a massive industrial place at one time as well. It's not anymore. Okay, so there's all of the remains of the mines on the mountain as well. Anyway, Robert Richards described the local beliefs about the hut circles, and he said that the people thought that they were portals, essentially, or gateways for the fairies to come in and out of. So when the mist descended, he said, or when nighttime comes, then this is where the fairies actually come out of.
That is
the Iron Age housing. Yeah. So the mountain is a real sort of fairy mountain. And I found some other stories about it as well in different books. One story about an old hag who lived down in the mountain, and it was taken from, so you can imagine this place was an industrial time an industrial place in the 19th century, and they would have been looking, going into the caves and things, looking for places to mine, really.
Yeah.
Like prospecting, I guess.
Yeah.
And the story was that these men went onto Craig Ruath. They had, a handful of candles, as many candles as they could find, and they, used them to go as deep into the mountain as they could. And when they got into the mountain, they found an old woman living down in there with a big brass pan, washing clothes in there. And this is super weird. I mean, amazing stuff.
Yeah, it is.
But you wouldn't know about it. No one had ever told me a story even remotely like that about the mountain in all the years that I've lived here. You actually have to go into the archives and dig it out to find it.
Yeah.
But very interesting.
Yeah. But I think that's that in itself, I think, is an interesting aspect of this, that somehow as you got deeper into things were revealed. Because I know that you said that, at one point you did try and look for information about folklore around the area, and it just wasn't forthcoming. And yet that seems to be something that happens as a part of all of this, is that once you start sort of getting into things, it kind of reminds me of, it sort of reflects whatever stage your research is at, if you like, and where you are, and kind of connecting with it on some kind of other level. I was going to say spiritual level, but I don't know if that's the right word, but it just does seem that things are revealed at the right time. So it is just really fascinating that that's all was able to kind of come together, and I'm sure you'll probably find more now as well, or hopefully now that it's out there, because you got a few bits from the public as well, didn't you, when you put something in the local paper? And then
I did, yeah. And there's an interesting thing here as well. I was talking with someone recently, because obviously this is Wales, so people speak both Welsh and English here, and some people are more Welsh than others. The questionnaire that I put out was in the Chronicle, which is the English newsletter.
Right.
I haven't put out a Welsh language version of my questionnaire yet, and I'm planning to in the Welsh newsletter, the Ysgub or Ysgub. So I'm wondering whether I might get different responses from the Welsh newsletter
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So, the things that I did get were little, just tiny little tidbits that suggested that there might still be, first of all, maybe people are still having experiences, or people have been having experiences in contemporary times, but also that there might still be a hint of the folklore as well left, of the stories as well. And some people had said, for instance, that their grandmother or something along those lines had seen fairies dancing at the bottom of the garden in their old house. In fact, I got two people saying that about two different houses. The interesting thing about this as well is, these household experiences is that they seem to be clustered around pretty old houses. Like my experience, my psychedelic experience was in the 17th, 16th century part of my friend's house.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's amazing.
Yeah. And these two houses that were mentioned, both of them are old listed buildings. One of them is a 17th century timber framed house. So again, there's an interesting, I don't know what the relationship is there, but it's interesting.
It's undisturbed, I guess you could say, is one thing, that it's been left undisturbed. And the same with a lot of when things happen out in nature, that's often in not always, but often in nature reserves, places that have been left undisturbed. So maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know.
It could be, yeah.
With the guy, when you were at his house and you had that psychedelic experience, so he and his family, none of them had ever sensed any kind of fairy presence or anything like that in the house before?
That's a good question, because I haven't really asked. Oh yeah, I was going to say about the room that my experience happened in.
Oh yeah.
That it was all decked out with stuff for magical ritual, because my friend, his older brother, it was his room, and he gave us the mushrooms as well.
Right.
As you can imagine. But he was into Wicca, and there was a chalk circle drawn out on the floor. We weren't doing any ritual or anything like that. We were just listening to Juno Reactor or something like that. And but I think it could well have contributed, because obviously magical circles are well-known fairy portals.
Absolutely. Where was the circle? Was it in relation to where you were sat and where you saw the fairies?
Yeah, the fairies were in the chest of drawers. So the circle was on the floor, and we were just sort of sitting around the edges with cushions and things.
Okay.
And I must have been looking across the circle to the chest of drawers to.
Okay. Yeah.
Which might be a factor.
That is very interesting. I mean, I think, that together with thinking about when you used to clamber up the mountain with cousins, and even when you went in the cave with your band and friends, and all of these things feel like, at the very least, communing with the landscape on some level, and maybe even an offering of some sort. So if you're playing music in there, that kind of maybe feels like a bit of an offering. But all of this, it really does make me think about, particularly the kind of outdoors ones, about communing with the landscape. And I was thinking after watching the Tanat Valley lecture seminar, I was thinking about some of the episodes of the podcast, in particular The Guardian of the Mountain, where he had actually he'd been up the mountain into a cave up there, the guy and the guest, and there was a chapel on the mountain next to the cave, and he had been in the cave and he had performed some kind of ritual before walking back down the mountain with his friend. And they'd done that loads of times. It was something, they'd known that mountain again since they were kids, and were just so familiar with it. I think that's another factor as well, the kind of familiarity.
Yeah.
And then, they had this incredible moment where this wolf appeared, but it didn't behave like, well, first they heard the growl. So there were different aspects to it. They heard this piercing, growl, and they were both completely terrified and stood to the spot, as you would if it might have been a wild animal as well. But then at the same time, running within that fear, he had this sense of, but I know this is something otherworldly. And somehow that sort of anchored him so that he didn't become too terrified by that. It was always, he was kind of telling himself, I know this isn't real, kind of thing. Not that it's real, but I know this is from another world. Although he did at the same time have this fear that they were going to be killed, which is terrifying. And then they saw it run off up the mountain, and it was shaking the bushes as it went. But before that happened, it was going around the mountain, and it kept reappearing in the same place and then running up the side of the mountain again, then reappearing again. It's almost like kind of something playing on a loop. So I don't know what you think about that.
I think these experiences are visceral interactions with place. At least that's part of them. I'm not saying that you can explain the whole thing in terms of that, but it seems to be what often triggers these experiences. And like I was saying before about this process of, like in mediumship, for example, where it's a long, sustained process of concentration and interaction to build up a presence. But I think there are some places, like for example, in my presentation, the men going down into the cave, going down into a cave is a visceral experience, and it puts you into a particular, sort of like responsive state, I suppose, ready to have some kind of an experience with something, regardless of what it is. And I think a similar kind of scenario is at play with the account from the Guardian of the Mountain that we were talking about, where the loud growling kind of kicks off the experience.
Yeah.
And what I think is that these kinds of spontaneous experiences, they're using the same processes as sort of spirit manifestation that I was talking about with mediums, but they don't require the same amount of ritual kind of coaxing to bring them into the social reality, because they're already very strong presences in the landscape. And that's why you can go to some places and you just have a feeling that place is a haunted place, for example. And this is what Rudolf Otto said, that this is kind of like the origin of religion, really, that people were moving through the landscape and they moved into places that felt like they had a particular presence or a particular feeling response. Otto talked about the numinous. He thought the numinous was essentially the basis of all religion, this experience that people have. And tying into what you were saying earlier, the numinous was characterized by terror and awe, two polarities of it. One is the mysterium tremendum, which is where it's terrifying and you don't know what's going on and you're afraid, you feel like you might die. And the other side of it is the awe and wonder and
the beauty
of it, and also the feeling of attraction towards it.
Yes.
Like it's a novelty. So this is what Rudolf Otto said, that there are some places that give rise to this kind of experience. And then his argument was, what happens then is that people put a label on that place, or they name it as a spirited place.
Yeah.
Okay. and then it builds and builds and builds. So then eventually you might have a shrine built there, for instance, and then the spirit takes on, a more divine form, and so on. And this was basically his argument. All religions stemmed from this. Basically, he thought of it like a primitive, deeply ingrained human feeling response that occurs in certain situations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's two things I want to say about that. Is that first of all, with you were saying that some people have a feeling about a certain place and then they might put a shrine there. And in that particular case with Guardian and Mountain, of course, there was a chapel there.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder why, I think I did ask him at the time who the chapel was dedicated to, and it was some kind of aspect of the Virgin Mary.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so at some point somebody felt the sacredness of that place and put a chapel there. But also over time, this kind of wise man who worked kind of on behalf of the King of Spain at the time, he set up this place there where he could live there as a hermit and have a whole library of occult books there, and he would I guess work his magic and live there and be there. So there's all these different layers, of people making sense of these places. But also it makes me think of and you talked about this a lot in Greening the Paranormal, a sense of personhood with a place. And I think that if it's a bit like with people, we do kind of sense and feel people's vibes, if you want to call it that. And there are some people that we innately kind of want to be closer to, and there are some people that we innately feel, you may never have met them before, but you can just sense that that you need to keep your wits about you, kind of thing. So that sense of personhood then being, we can make sense of that in the landscape too, that there are these places, even in places of great beauty, there's a sense of warning given, that lots of different generations of people pick up on. So I guess I guess you would have looked at that sense of personhood and the vibe that a place gives.
Yeah, I think this issue of personhood, because personhood is really, it's a human category. It's a human thing. Maybe other things don't think in terms of personhood, but it's a human thing. And I think it's a human way of establishing relationships. Again, it all comes back down to this thing. And, we establish relationships with other persons. So it's a very important category because, the things that we consider persons or not, all automatically dictates, how we're going to interact with those things.
Yeah.
And you can see the way this has panned out in, Nazi Germany, for example, when people are not considered as persons, then they get treated in very destructive ways. So, personhood in a lot of ways is about establishing a relationship, or who are we going to establish relationships with? And I think that's the same with place as well. We use the same processes of determining personhood in a place. And if we get that sense of the personhood of a place, then we relate to it better. We give it a name. Again, it's the same thing that Otto was talking about. We give it a name, it becomes a relatable entity, and we kind of come to know it.
Yeah.
And we establish a relationship, and then we can actually have a communication.
Yeah.
This is a peculiar thing about Western ways of thinking about personhood, is that they've tended to, focus purely on the human, really. In our Western society, what other persons are there? Even animals are not. We don't really think about animals as persons. Maybe we do on an individual one-to-one basis, but on a bigger cultural scale, we don't. And the same goes for, broader ecosystems as well. in the Western world. I mean, we used to have these frameworks, and I think all of this fairy folklore associated with particular landscapes and environments is a remnant of that older way of engaging with the environment as a person.
Yeah.
We had it, and it's kind of being lost as well, or forgotten about. But that also raises, because if it's been forgotten, then it suggests that it's a purely cultural thing, that can be forgotten, but it's not an experience.
I don't know, because I mean, I would say I definitely have experienced that. I think, personally speaking, I guess you have too, and I know other people would agree that they have, that there are some places where I've been to, and there's something about them that it's like you're meeting them for the first time, and there's an ambivalence there. You're not entirely sure if you're welcome or not. If it's got a strong personality. And then over time, that can really shift to the point where if I go to some of those places now where I initially was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. This is an interesting sense here. I now feel like I'm being welcomed by an old friend if I go there, and it's a place, So that's something that I've experienced, and I know lots of other people have. So I would say that it is more experiential. Yeah.
I think the experience is still there, but the question is, are people still telling stories about it? Or do we have individual experiences like I've had, my sister had, and we just kind of keep it to ourselves, and it doesn't then become folklore, does it? It stays sort of hidden and private.
Yes.
I'm very interested as well to know not just whether there are, stories still circulating in the area, but also whether people are still actually having experiences as well. I think they probably are, but we don't like to talk about those kind of experiences anymore.
No, this is it. And I think, listening to your seminar about deep weird, now, what really fascinated me about that, and I'm really keen to ask you about this, is this idea of the boggle threshold.
Yeah.
And, I feel like we're talking about people, whether or not they feel able to talk about their experiences. I guess a big part of this project, well, the main part of the project for the Modern Fairy Sightings project is that it's a place for people to share their experiences so that other people who've had those experiences can just go, oh, okay, yeah, this, it's not just me, and it's somewhere that they can go and relate and validate their own experiences. But as a side effect of that, if other people find the podcast and they listen to it, I suppose, thinking about the boggle threshold, I'm hoping, I guess, that it might raise some boggle thresholds there.
Yeah.
And in doing so, if that just sort of gets normalized, that people have these experiences, then people will start talking about places maybe in that sort of way again, because they can relate to it, because probably most people have. It's like, even if you think about, say, in lockdown, we really kind of looked so deep within ourselves, and we were all going through trauma in some way or another. And one thing that people would do would be to go off, for a walk, which they might not have been able to do had they been at work, but if they're working from home. I know not everyone was in this situation, but for a lot of people it was like this. And just to be able to go to a local park and find a place of peace and feel nurtured and welcomed, that, I feel, that's what we're talking about really in terms of like personhood of place. So yeah, tell me about boggle threshold, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, well, the idea of a boggle threshold, it was from the historian of psychical research, Renee Haynes, and her idea basically was that everyone has their own threshold for the amount of weirdness that they can accommodate. And these thresholds they're present in culture, they're present in our social family groups and our friendship groups and peer groups and all that kind of stuff. They exist on an individual level, but they also exist on sort of disciplinary levels as well. So, and she would talk about how, in the humanities, boggle thresholds are probably a little bit higher or lower, depending on how you want to think about it.
Okay.
to let the weird in.
Okay.
And in the hard sciences, the boggle thresholds are either very high or very low to prevent the weirdness from getting in. So they have different values, really. So this is what a boggle threshold is, and some, it comes through in all sorts of interesting places in research on extraordinary experience. So, for example, there is this whole literature that's pretty well established about religious experiences, going back to people like William James, and they have a good, strong lineage. And within that literature, there's certain kinds of experiences that it's kind of safe to talk about. So things like, for example, visions of religious figures, for instance, is a pretty standard one, or seeing lights or things like that, visions of lights or whatever. These are kind of safe, standard experiences that you can talk about, or hearing voices and things like that. Very weird experiences, undoubtedly, but they're also safe and they're kind of well documented and well established. But then there are other kinds of experiences that seem to exceed people's boggle thresholds, and they can't let them in. And usually that's when experiences start to break down or blur distinctions between nice, neat academic categories. So, for example, it's all well and good to talk about a nice, clean, religious experience. For example, someone has a vision of Jesus or the Buddha or whatever. But then if you introduce into that experience a flying saucer, or it happened on psychedelics, or there was some kind of weird telepathic communication between the experiencer and the entity, or anything like that, as soon as it starts to get more complicated, then the boggle threshold kicks in and the experiences get kind of brushed away to the side, and they become what Charles Fort called damned facts, essentially. Things that science doesn't want to accommodate, because it doesn't fit into the established frameworks and categories that science has got, or because it challenges fundamental assumptions of science, for instance, or not just science, or culture or a religion. Religions also do this, don't they? They allow certain things and they disallow other things. So it's a really interesting idea, the boggle threshold. You can see how influential it is, but also how it can divert attention away from some of these more subtle complexities, and it almost reduces extraordinary experiences into these neat categories, when actually, in reality, they're often much more chaotic and interconnected. And
this is it. I think the latest episode, which went out last week, was the Wretched Rider in the Thorn. And this, when I arranged to speak to my guest, I knew that he was going to tell me about a specific encounter. And, by and large, I don't usually know exactly what somebody's going to talk to me about. But that ended up, it had a UFO experience that kicked it off. And he'd also been going up there with some friends, and they'd done, done a ritual and sort of got chased off the mountain by a really strong wind, this kind of wind of spirit. And that was interesting, hearing how various members of that group, one particular, was very skeptical, and they were the ones that said, it feels like the spirits are telling us to go, things like that. So people were really, really feeling this. And it might be on the one hand, if you were doing this research, you might just say, oh, well, okay, I'm researching fairy experiences, because the crescendo of the whole thing was that he was coming off, he'd gone there to meditate in a highly charged emotional state. So he was having a bad time, and as he walked away, he came face to face with this creature, otherworldly creature, clinging to the mane of a horse. And it was staring right at him, and as he got closer, it bared its teeth. Now he had no choice but to walk towards it, because his car was back that way, and there was no way to get the other side, because it was a sheer cliff face where he'd walked from. So he literally had no choice but to walk towards it, and this event happened, which was terrifying, but also at the same time really amazing for him as well. Exactly what you were describing before. So there are all these, again, there's these layers to what happened. And as a fairy researcher, I could say, oh, well, I'm just interested in this bit, this fairy aspect of it. But, like you, I feel like you need to look at the whole picture here. Not only because all of that took place on this landscape, but also because of his own experience, what was happening to him. So, we could look at the landscape itself and say, right, well, it had been the scene of, bloody battles and goodness knows what else, really, because there had been, very early Britons, and then, battles and Romans, and just all sorts of different layers of experience happening on that mountain. But like I said, also his experience too. So, I think you've got to look at the whole picture. And yes, it does become more difficult than what we're used to, I suppose. But do you think, say, for instance, in the with anthropology, people's boggle thresholds, and I'm talking about academics here, and willingness to look at the kind of holistic, take a holistic approach, do you think that is shifting
in anthropology?
Yeah.
I think anthropology is a very broad thing as well.
Yeah.
There are parts of anthropology that are very sort of biological and to do with human evolution and all of that kind of stuff, which is, for those kinds of anthropologists, all of this this kind of talk is something else. But for within social and cultural anthropology, again, there are some strands of it that are much more sort of positivistic, but there is also the more interpretivist kind of angle. And within that, I mean, this is what anthropologists have been doing, from the very beginning, really. But there is a whole, tradition, and there are methods for engaging with other people's, worldviews and different beliefs and things like that. I mean, this is what anthropological, social anthropological bread and butter.
Exactly.
So I think, anthropology is in a really good place, for people who want to take a scholarly academic approach to these kind of things. Anthropology is in a great place. There's already, that body of literature there that you can build on. And in more recent years as well, there's been the growth of this sort of paranthropological thing, which I've been involved with, but it didn't come from me. It's got a long lineage that goes right back to the beginning of anthropology, really. But it's definitely in the last 10 years, there has been a bit of an opening up, I think, of these anthropologists. Yeah.
What do you think is causing that? What do you think is behind this opening? Because I think that you're seeing it and feeling it in the academic world, but I think we're also just generally feeling it. I mean, people are talking about these things more. People are interested. I mean, look at the culture in itself, particularly youth culture. I've got a 19-year-old son, and he tells me that a lot of his friends are really into all sorts of occult and supernatural stuff. Not that he is necessarily himself, but it's a cultural thing. And with television and Stranger Things, and this is really massive. People are kind of reminds me a little bit of the 70s, actually, because the 70s was a bit like this as well.
The occult revival.
Exactly. So yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, these things they go through phases, don't they? They flare up and then they die back down and they flare up again. And lots of people have suggested all sorts of different reasons why that might be the case. But one thing that is happening at the moment, obviously, is a lot of fear and uncertainty and all of that kind of thing. And it's the classic, psychological functionalist explanation for the supernatural, which I don't necessarily 100% buy, but I think it's a part of it, is that there is a lot more anxiety and a lot more thinking about things like death, for example, which makes you think and question, doesn't it, and explore new other possibilities. So there is that.
That's true.
But I also think we could look at this from another perspective, like from a postmodernist kind of view, and talk about the fragmentation of society and how everyone's become more individually kind of oriented. And when we move into the domains then of individual spiritualities and things like that, where we have a freedom, especially in Western societies, to sort of pick and choose the beliefs and ideas that we adopt and that we kind of incorporate into our identity. So we're much freer than people were, 50, 100 years ago to do that.
Long may that continue.
Yeah. But another thing that I quite like the idea of as well is one of Charles Fort's ideas about dominance. And this is kind of like a precursor to the idea of paradigms from Thomas Kuhn in the 60s. But Charles Fort was writing about this in like 1900. And he said a dominant is a long period of, when a particular model of the world is in ascendance and all other worldviews are kind of lesser. And he said that we, at the moment, or when he was writing, we were in a dominant of exclusion, where we were excluding stuff from our worldview. So he was amassing all of this damned data that science wasn't interested in. So his view of science was that it was excluding all of this stuff. But he had a vision of a future society that was more inclusive, a dominant of inclusion is what he talked about. And I think in a lot of ways we're moving in that kind of direction. He preempted it 120 years ago, but we're moving towards bringing things in. Well, this is what I'd like to see anyway, bringing things in rather than excluding stuff.
That's right.
And we have now proliferations of different kinds of gender identities, for instance. This is an inclusive, not excluding people because they feel differently and things like that, but actually embracing that complexity and diversity. And I think that might be part. That's an optimistic view of what's happening, because obviously there are other processes that are going on in the earth as well.
Yeah, I mean, in that way, it does feel expansive, doesn't it? It feels like something is growing. It feels expansive, and it does feel like this is growing. And even before COVID, although I suppose that whole time since kind of COVID lockdown has definitely pressurized things even more, and even more people are interested in this. But even before that, I mean, even sort of particularly from about sort of 5 years ago, people became much more interested in these sorts of subjects. So maybe we were heading in this direction, and this intense time has accelerated that. And that kind of sense of looking within yourself as well, maybe looking for your own truths, what makes sense to you. Because when everything that you're seeing is so chaotic, perhaps that's just innately what we do. We just have to kind of look for the truth because it doesn't seem apparent externally.
But it's an interesting thing, because we all find different truths as well.
Well, that's true. And then, I was thinking about, Weber argued about science and technology taking over from magic and religion. But that kind of looks like it's switching around again, which is quite interesting. I mean, okay, there's massive, we can't really do that technology, but also there's a big backlash towards technology at the moment as well.
There is, yeah.
So this is interesting. So, is it swinging? Are we seeing a swing back round again right now?
Another interesting thing is the way that technologies kind of feed into and become a part of all of this stuff, like new emergent technologies, like, for example, like text messages from the dead and things like that.
Right.
Old phenomena merge into new technological spaces, and it gives opportunities for new kinds of interactions. I wonder about fairies and technology, and new forms of fairy experience that are mediated by technologies. I mean, I can imagine it probably has already happened somewhere, but it's interesting, isn't it? It opens up new possibilities for these old experiences to adapt and move forward.
It's true. Yeah, I would like to hear about anything like that. People talk about there being gremlins in the system. Yeah, that is interesting. Well, I guess we've had a bit of that tonight with my Wi-Fi going haywire as well. The other thing I wanted to ask you, the 4 theories that you had spoken about were, so there's David Hufford's experiential, which we've also talked a little bit about as well. And then John Keel's window areas, these places where the supernatural might exist. And the sacred geography, the Messier-Eliade idea. And then Durkheim's idea that all these things are just social constructs produced by society for the benefit of society, a little bit like, say, religion might be to allow things to function in a certain way. I guess my feeling on that was that it might be a little bit of all of those things. Is that what you've kind of concluded?
Yeah, exactly. Usually that's the case, that it's not an either or situation. It's a both and plus other things as well. This is what I mean by when I talk about ontological flooding. That in order to understand any situation, we need to be open to multiple simultaneous processes, all functioning at the same time. And these things, they might not even be, they could be all sorts of different things, not just physiological and psychological processes and all that kind of stuff, but bringing in the idea of there being subtle minds or plants and things like that having consciousness. All of these things are going to be interacting in any given situation. So we need a framework that allows us to bring in all of these different strands. So when we talk about Messier-Eliade and Rudolf Otto, for example, saying that we can have these experiences in the world, that there is a thing out there, that's all well and good, but it's also just one part of the stuff. Durkheim saying that it's all created socially constructed, essentially, and he's not wrong. It is all socially constructed as well. When we interact with these things, we know from all sorts of accounts and analyses of different people's accounts that we bring our cultural lenses to bear on these experiences. And we do create stories, and we do tell stories, and it is human beings that keep these traditions alive, in the same way that Durkheim says we do go back to these places. Ritually, it becomes a social and ritual thing. So it's not as simple as saying it's just, like you're saying, it's not just socially constructed. It is socially constructed, but there are other things as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's really great. And very excited for Deep Weird then. So when is that going to be coming out?
Well, yeah, the plan is for it to come out. It should be early to mid next year.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Another thing associated with Deep, yeah, the chapters were due in on Halloween, so I've started to get them all coming in now. In May, I'm also going to be doing a Deep Weird symposium for the Parapsychological Association about deep weird or high strangeness and parapsychology, and what parapsychology might be able to tell us about high strangeness. So that'll be
Excellent.
fun, and it should
That'd be
coincide
great.
with the book, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, well, definitely let us know about that then nearer the time. And yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much again for
thanks for
giving
having me.
your time and having a good old chinwag about these matters. And all the best with all your projects as well.
Thank you very much, and to you too.